As Formula One has evolved over time, efforts have been made to diversify the race calendar and spread the sport's influence under its moniker as a world championship. The Middle East has become a major motorsport hub in the 21st century, possessing the money and facilities to host top-tier events, despite not having a strong motorsport tradition or culture. The first Middle Eastern excursion into Formula One has divided fans with variable qualities of races, and the hosts have come under scrutiny for their human rights record, but it has cemented itself as a staple of the Formula One calendar. This is the story of the Bahrain Grand Prix. As with most other nations in the Middle East, the Kingdom of Bahrain had its fortunes transformed with the discovery of vast oil and natural gas reserves in the mid-20th century, which turned it from a small island nation dependent on pearl fishing into a powerhouse economy and a major tourism, banking and transport hub. At the turn of the 21st century, Crown Prince Sheikh Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa began pushing for Bahrain to become the first Middle Eastern nation to host a Formula One Grand Prix, fighting off competition from nearby countries such as Egypt, Lebanon and the United Arab Emirates. In 2002, construction of the Bahrain International Circuit began at Sakhir in the centre of the country, costing $150 million to build. Designed by Herman Tilke, the circuit featured a drag strip, large runoff areas, impressive grandstands and a distinctive observation tower. The circuit itself featured a mixture of long straights and both high and low speed corners, featuring 6 different configurations, and was regarded as one of the safest circuits in the world. Due to its location in the middle of the desert, the sand surrounding the track was glued down in order to prevent it blowing onto the track in the event of a sandstorm. The Bahrain Grand Prix was approved for the 2004 Formula One season. However, there were delays in getting the circuit ready, but it was still set to go ahead in early April as the third round of the season, despite not all facilities being completed. The circuit proved challenging for the drivers as the sweltering heat tested their stamina and the 60+ degree track temperatures wreaked havoc with the tyres on long runs, as well as struggling for grip with the dusty nature of the circuit. 6-time champion and defending champion Michael Schumacher took the first pole position at the circuit, with Ferrari teammate Rubens Barrichello 4 tenths behind in second. On race day, a temperature drop of 20 degrees meant Ferrari had little concerns over tyre endurance, and Schumacher took a comfortable win, the third of 3 races so far that year and the 73rd of his career, and also the fastest lap. Barrichello was less than 2 seconds behind in second. The BAR of Jenson Button had started 6th but managed to climb through in the race to finish another 25 seconds behind in 3rd. The Renault of Jarno Trulli had started 7th and also climbed through to finish 5 seconds behind in 4th. Button's teammate Takuma Sato started 5th and finished 5th. The Renault of Fernando Alonso started a lowly 16th but stormed his way to 6th, finishing right on Sato's tail. The Williams of Ralf Schumacher had started 4th but struggled with race pace and dropped to 7th, and the Jaguar of Mark Webber was the final point scorer in 8th. There were 17 classified finishers, as the McLaren of Kimi Raikkonen suffered an engine failure on lap 8, the Minardi of Zsolt Baumgartner also had an engine failure on lap 45, and David Coulthard gave McLaren a double retirement with a pneumatic failure on lap 51. For 2005, the exit of turn 4 was widened slightly, which extended the circuit's length by 5 metres. It was the Renault of Fernando Alonso who took pole position by half a second from the now 7-time champion Michael Schumacher, driving the brand new Ferrari F2005 for the first time. Alonso's main rival Kimi Raikkonen of McLaren had qualified all the way down in 9th, behind his teammate Pedro Della Rosa, who was filling in for injured teammate Juan Pablo Montoya and had not raced since 2002. Qualifying took place on the same day that Pope John Paul II died, so several teams and drivers offered marks of respect, including Ferrari having black nose cones on their cars, similar to at the 2001 Italian Grand Prix, which took place the weekend after the September 11th attacks. Race day also saw record Grand Prix temperatures, with an air temperature of 42.5 degrees Celsius and a track temperature of 56 degrees Celsius. Alonso went on to take his second win of the season. Schumacher had been pushing him hard in the opening laps, but span at turn 9 on lap 12 and retired to the pits with a hydraulic failure. The Toyota of Jarno Trulli had started third and went on to finish 13 seconds behind Alonso in second. Raikkonen made up for his poor qualifying to finish third. The Toyota of Ralf Schumacher started 6th and finished 4th. Della Rosa impressed McLaren as he finished 5th and set the fastest lap of the race and the lap record, which he still holds to this day. The Williams of Mark Webber started 5th but dropped down to 6th. The Sauber of Felipe Massa was lapped but had leapt up from 12th to 7th, and the Red Bull of David Coulthard rounded up the points finishing positions after starting 14th. It was a race of attrition with only 13 classified finishers. Alongside Schumacher, the Red Bull of Christian Klein had failed to even start the race after suffering an electrical failure on the grid. The Jordan of Narain Carter-Cain had an electrical failure of his own on lap 3. The Renault of Giancarlo Fisichella had an engine failure on lap 5. The Williams of Nick Heidfeld had an engine failure on lap 26. And BAR had a double retirement with Takuma Sato losing the brakes on lap 28 and Jenson Button losing the clutch on lap 47. The Sauber of Jacques Villeneuve had a suspension failure on lap 55 but was still classified in 11th. For 2006, the Bahrain Grand Prix became the opening round of the season as it swapped places with the Australian Grand Prix to avoid that conflicting with the Commonwealth Games. As such, it was the first race of the 2.4-litre V8 era and the first race for teams BMW Sauber, Scuderia Toro Rosso, Midland F1 and Super Aguri and drivers Nico Rosberg, Scott Speed and Yuji Ide. It was also the first race to use the current elimination-style qualifying split into 3 sections. It was the Ferrari of Michael Schumacher who took pole position by less than 0.05 of a second from teammate Felipe Massa, making his debut with the Scuderia. The Honda of Jenson Button was 3rd, and the Renault of defending champion Fernando Alonso was 4th. Alonso stormed up to 2nd on the first lap and after a close battle with Schumacher went on to win the race by just over a second. Massa's span at turn 1 early on and almost took out Alonso in the process, and from then on was not a threat and finished outside the points. The McLaren of Kimi Raikkonen had crashed in Q1 and not set a time and therefore started 22nd and last but powered through to finish 3rd. Button finished less than a second behind Raikkonen. The McLaren of Juan Pablo Montoya started 5th and finished 5th. The Williams of Mark Webber started 7th and finished 6th. Teammate Rosberg impressed on his debut by jumping from 12th to 7th and set the fastest lap of the race. The Red Bull of Christian Klein took the final point in 8th. 18 drivers finished the race. The Midland of Christian Albers stalled on the grid and pulled into the garage at the end of lap 1 with a driveshaft failure. The Renault of Giancarlo Fisichella suffered a hydraulic failure on lap 22. The BMW Sauber of Jacques Villeneuve did the same on lap 30, and the Super Aguri of Yuji Ide had run over his pit crew and shown abominable race pace and had an engine failure of his own on lap 36. For 2007, the Bahrain Grand Prix reverted back to being the 3rd round of the season. The circuit was awarded the FIA Institute Centre of Excellence Award, given for excellent safety standards, marshalling and medical facilities. The Ferrari of Felipe Massa had been fastest in all 3 qualifying sessions and took pole position by 0.3 from the McLaren of rookie Lewis Hamilton. Massa's teammate Kimi Raikkonen was 3rd, and the McLaren of defending champion Fernando Alonso was 4th. Massa took a comfortable lights-to-flag victory and the fastest lap, 2 seconds in front of Hamilton, who became the first ever F1 driver to finish on the podium in their first 3 races. Raikkonen was 8 seconds further back in 3rd. The BMW Sauber of Nick Heidfeld was only 3 seconds behind in 4th. Alonso struggled for pace and was passed by Heidfeld in the pit stop phase and finished just behind him. Heidfeld's teammate Robert Kubica was another 30 seconds further back in 6th. The Toyota of Jarno Trulli jumped from 9th to 7th, and the Renault of Giancarlo Fisichella was just behind in 8th. 16 drivers finished the race. The Honda of Jenson Button and the Toro Rosso of Scott Speed collided at turn 4 on lap 1, and in so doing triggered the first ever safety car at the Bahrain Grand Prix. Tonio Liuzzi gave Toro Rosso a double retirement with a hydraulic failure on lap 27. The Super Aguri of Takuma Sato suffered an engine failure on lap 27. Red Bull suffered a double retirement of their own, with David Coulthard losing the drive shaft on lap 37 and Mark Webber losing the gearbox on lap 42. And Anthony Davidson gave Super Aguri a double retirement as well with an engine failure on lap 52. The 2008 race was overshadowed by claims from News of the World that FIA President Max Mosley had paid prostitutes for sex. Mosley denied the allegations, but even so decided not to attend the race. The BMW Sauber of Robert Kubica took a surprise pole position by less than 0.03 of a second from the Ferrari of Felipe Massa. The McLaren of vice-champion Lewis Hamilton was 3rd, and the Ferrari of defending champion Kimi Raikkonen was 4th. Massa took the lead at the start and went on to win the race for the 2nd year in a row. Raikkonen also passed Kubica in the race and beat him to 2nd by less than 2 seconds. The BMW Sauber of Nick Heidfeld started 5 places behind Kubica but finished just behind him in 4th. The McLaren of Heikki Kovalainen was 5th and also got the fastest lap. The Toyota of Jarno Trulli started 7th and finished 6th. The Red Bull of Mark Webber jumped from 11th to 7th, and the Williams of Nico Rosberg took the final point in 8th. Hamilton had a poor start and on lap 2 rear-ended the Renault with former teammate Fernando Alonso and broke his front wing and dropped way down the order and finished 13th. A record 19 drivers finished the race, with the Toro Rosso of Sebastian Vettel crashing out on lap 1, the Honda of Jenson Button crashing out on lap 20, and the Renault of Nelson Piquet Jr. suffering a hydraulic failure on lap 41. In 2009, the Bahrain Grand Prix swapped places with the Chinese Grand Prix to become the fourth round of the season. The new technical regulations in 2009 had created a large inversion in the running order, and it was the Toyotas of Jarno Trulli and Timo Glock that occupied the front row of the grid. The Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel, who had won the last race, was third, the Brawn of Jenson Button, who had won the first two races, was fourth, and the McLaren of defending champion Lewis Hamilton was fifth. Toyota's race pace ultimately proved to be far worse than their qualifying pace, and Button took his third win of the season by 7 seconds from Vettel, with Trulli another 2 seconds behind in third, but he also set the fastest lap. Hamilton was fourth, Button's teammate Rubens Barrichello went from 6th to 5th, the Ferrari of Kimi Raikkonen went from 10th to 6th, Glock dropped all the way down to 7th, and the Renault of Fernando Alonso took the final point in 8th. The only retirement of the race was the Williams of Kazuki Nakajima, who pulled into the pits with rising oil pressure on lap 49. Some big changes came in 2010. The Bahrain Grand Prix became the opening round of the season once again, and as it also marked the beginning of Formula One's 60th anniversary year, all living drivers' champions except Nelson Piquet and Kimi Raikkonen attended the Grand Prix, with all of them doing parade laps in their championship-winning cars, except for three-time champion Sir Jack Brabham, who was almost 84 years old at the time and was the last living drivers' champion to have won the title in the 1950s. As it was the first round of the season, it was the debut race for teams Lotus, Virgin and HRT, and drivers Nico Hülkenberg, Vitaly Petrov, Lucas di Grassi, Bruno Senna and Karun Chandhok. This was also the first ever race run with points up to 10th place, and the first without in-race refuelling, and saw the debut of the Bahrain endurance layout, extending the length of the circuit by half a mile. The Red Bull of vice-champion Sebastian Vettel took pole, just ahead of the Ferraris of Felipe Massa and Fernando Alonso. Vettel had initially been comfortably leading the race, but 2/3 of the way through, his V8 became a V6, and he eventually dropped down to 4th. Alonso inherited the lead and won on his debut with Ferrari and set the fastest lap, 15 seconds ahead of teammate Massa, with the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton third. Nico Rosberg finished just behind Vettel on his debut with Mercedes, and teammate Michael Schumacher, who had made a surprise return to Formula One, finished 6th. The McLaren of defending champion Jenson Button finished 7th, just ahead of the Red Bull of Mark Webber. The Force India of Tonio Liuzzi jumped from 12th to 9th, and the Williams of Rubens Barrichello took the final point spot in 10th. Only 15 of the 24 drivers finished the race. The HRT of Karun Chandhok, whose car was still being built on the Friday and had done only 1 or 2 laps in qualifying on a full tank of fuel, hit a bump he did not know existed on lap 2 and broke the suspension. The Virgin of Lucas di Grassi suffered a hydraulic failure on lap 3. The BMW Sauber of Kamui Kobayashi suffered an engine failure on lap 12. The Renault with Vitaly Petrov broke his suspension on lap 14. Glock gave Virgin a double retirement on their debut with a gearbox failure on lap 17. Senna also gave HRT a double retirement on their debut after pulling over on the main straight with an overheating airbox on lap 18. And Pedro Della Rosa gave BMW Sauber a double retirement as well with a hydraulic failure on lap 29. The Lotus of Jarno Trulli and the Toro Rosso of Sebastian Buemi suffered a hydraulic failure and an electrical failure respectively on lap 47, but they were both still classified as 16th and 17th. The endurance layout was not well received, as it offered no overtaking opportunities and killed the rhythm of the circuit, so going forward the decision was made to revert back to the original layout. The Bahrain Grand Prix was set to once again be the opening round of the season in 2011. However, the ongoing civil unrest in Bahrain due to the Arab Spring protests meant the race was postponed a month before it was due to take place. In June, it was announced by the World Motorsport Council that the race would now take place in October as the 17th round of the season. This decision was met with criticism by both team bosses and drivers, who did not want the season finale to now have to take place in December, and also pointed fingers at the nation's human rights record, including use of torture, so the decision was made to abandon the race completely. The Bahrain Grand Prix returned in 2012 as the 4th round of the season, despite protests from human rights campaigners. It was the first Bahrain Grand Prix to be run with Pirelli tyres, and with DRS. The Red Bull of defending champion Sebastian Vettel took pole by a 10th from the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton. Vettel's teammate Mark Webber was 3rd, and Hamilton's teammate Jenson Button was 4th. Vettel went on to win the race and set the fastest lap, but received a strong challenge from the Lotuses of Kimi Raikkonen and Romain Grosjean, who started 11th and 7th and finished 2nd and 3rd. Webber was 4th, The Mercedes of Nico Rosberg was 5th, the Force India of Paul di Resta briefly led the race and finished 6th, the Ferrari of Fernando Alonso jumped from 9th to 7th, Hamilton had a botched pit stop and dropped from 2nd to 8th, the Ferrari of Felipe Massa finished 9th, and the Mercedes of Michael Schumacher, who had started 22nd, took the final point in 10th. The only retirements were the Marussia of Charles Pic, who had an engine failure on lap 25, and the Williams of Pastor Maldonado, who spun off with a puncture. The Williams of Bruno Senna stopped with the vibrations on lap 55, and Button suffered an exhaust failure on lap 56, but they were still classified in 18th and 22nd. In 2013, the Bahrain Grand Prix was once again the 4th round of the season. There were protests once again, but they were largely ignored. The Mercedes of Nico Rosberg took pole, 2 tenths ahead of the Red Bull of defending champion Sebastian Vettel. The Ferraris of Fernando Alonso and Felipe Massa were 3rd and 4th. Vettel took the lead from Rosberg on the 2nd lap and went on to win the race and set the fastest lap for the 2nd year in a row, in what was a rare occasion of 2 consecutive races having the same podium, as the Lotuses of Kimi Raikkonen and Romain Grosjean jumped from 8th and 11th to finish 2nd and 3rd once again. The Force India of Paul di Resta once again ran a long first stint and finished a career-best 4th. The Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton started 9th and finished 5th. The McLaren of Sergio Perez jumped from 12th to 6th after battling needlessly aggressively with teammate Jenson Button. The Red Bull of Mark Webber was some 40 seconds behind his teammate in 7th. Alonso's DRS got stuck open in the first stint and was then stuck closed for the rest of it, leaving him 8th. Pole sitter Rosberg endured poor tyre wear and dropped to 9th, and Button was 10th. The only retirement was the Toro Rosso of Jean-Eric Vergne, who collided with the Caterham of Guido van der Garde and the Force India of Adrian Sutil on the first lap and got a puncture and pulled into the garage on lap 17 with floor damage. In 2014, to commemorate the Bahrain Grand Prix's 10-year anniversary, it was made a night race, becoming only the 2nd night race after the Singapore Grand Prix, and it went back to being the 3rd round of the season. There were protests once again, which again were largely ignored. As within 2009, the changes to technical regulations in 2014 created a large inversion in the running order. It was the Mercedes of Nico Rosberg who took pole position for the 2nd year in a row by 3 tenths from teammate Lewis Hamilton, who himself was 6 tenths faster than the Red Bull of Daniel Ricciardo, who was relegated to 13th on the grid for an unsafe pit release. His teammate, the defending champion Sebastian Vettel, was way down in 10th. What unfolded on Sunday became known as the duel in the desert, as Hamilton took the lead at the start. Rosberg attempted to take the lead back towards the end of the first stint, and they then went back and forth for the lead in the final few laps, with Hamilton eventually coming through to win, which many saw as the start of their heated rivalry that took place over the next 3 years, but Rosberg did get fastest lap. The Force India of Sergio Perez took his first ever podium after starting 4th. Ricciardo climbed through to finish 5th. Perez's teammate Nico Hülkenberg was 6th. The Williams of Felipe Massa started 7th and finished 7th. His teammate Valtteri Bottas had started 3rd but dropped down to 8th, and the Ferraris of Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen were 9th and 10th. There were 17 classified finishers. The Sauber of Adrian Sutil collided with the Marussia of Jules Bianchi at turn 1 on lap 18. The Toro Rosso of Jean-Eric Vergne hit the Lotus of Pastor Maldonado on lap 1 and retired with the damage on lap 19. The Caterham of Marcus Ericsson had an oil leak on lap 34. Esteban Gutierrez gave Sauber a double retirement as he was hit by Maldonado at turn 1 on lap 40 and sent into a barrel roll, and the McLaren of Kevin Magnussen lost the clutch on lap 41. His teammate Jenson Button had a clutch failure of his own on lap 56 but was still classified in 17th. In 2015, the Bahrain Grand Prix was the 4th round of the season once again. Human rights campaigners protested the race once again, but this time it was formally acknowledged by Formula One, as there had recently been a report by Amnesty International of unabated human rights violations in Bahrain, so Formula One made a commitment to respecting human rights there. The Mercedes of defending champion Lewis Hamilton took pole position by 4 tenths of a second from the Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel, with their respective teammates Nico Rosberg and Kimi Raikkonen in 3rd and 4th. Hamilton took a rather more comfortable win than the year before by 3 seconds from Raikkonen, who took fastest lap. Rosberg had overheating brakes the entire race and finished 3rd. The Williams of Valtteri Bottas was 4th. Vettel had an off that damaged his front wing and necessitated an extra pit stop and was just behind in 5th. The Red Bull of Daniel Ricciardo started 7th and finished 6th. The Lotus of Romain Grosjean came from 10th to 7th. The Force India of Sergio Perez followed behind. The Red Bull of Daniel Kvyat jumped from 17th to 9th, and the Williams of Felipe Massa started from the pit lane and finished 10th. The McLaren of Jenson Button never even started the race as he had ECU problems, and Toro Rosso suffered a double retirement with Carlos Sainz getting a broken wheel hub on lap 30 and Max Verstappen having an electrical failure on lap 35. The 2016 event was the second round of the season and saw the second and final running of a controversial new elimination-style qualifying in which every 90 seconds whoever was slowest on the timesheets would be eliminated. It hadn't worked as planned in Australia as there were large gaps where no cars ran as the intention was for the drivers to set continuous laps. The Mercedes of defending champion Lewis Hamilton took pole for the second year in a row, just ahead of teammate Rosberg, with the Ferraris of Sebastian Vettel and Kimi Raikkonen third and fourth. Rosberg went on to take his first ever Bahrain Grand Prix win and the fastest lap, 10 seconds ahead of Raikkonen. Hamilton had a poor start and was hit by the Williams of Valtteri Bottas at turn 2 and took damage and finished third. The Red Bull of Daniel Ricciardo finished fourth. The Haas of Romain Grosjean had a strong race and jumped from 9th to 5th. The Toro Rosso of Max Verstappen was just behind in 6th, beating Daniel Kvyat at senior team Red Bull. The Williams drivers of Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas finished 8th and 9th, and Stoffel Van Dorn, who was filling in for an injured Fernando Alonso at McLaren, impressed on his debut to finish 10th. Vettel never started the race as he had an engine failure on the formation lap, and the Renault of Jolyon Palmer pulled into the pit lane at the end of the formation lap with a hydraulic failure as well. The McLaren of Jenson Button suffered an engine failure on lap 7, the Haas of Esteban Gutierrez had a brake failure on lap 11, and the Toro Rosso of Carlos Sainz got a puncture on the first lap and retired on lap 30. In 2017, the Bahrain Grand Prix went back to being the third round of the season. The Mercedes of Valtteri Bottas took the first pole position of his career, just 300ths ahead of teammate Lewis Hamilton. The Ferrari of championship leader Sebastian Vettel was third. Vettel ran a smart strategy to win the race by 6 seconds from Hamilton, who had to take a 5-second time penalty for blocking the Red Bull of Daniel Ricciardo in the pits but still got fastest lap. Bottas had been ordered to let Hamilton through and finished third. Vettel's teammate Kimi Raikkonen was just behind in 4th. Ricciardo finished 5th, the Williams of Felipe Massa was 6th, the Force India of Sergio Perez started 18th but stormed his way to 7th, the Haas of Romain Grosjean was 8th, the Renault of Nico Hülkenberg was 9th, and Perez's teammate Esteban Ocon also had a strong race after starting 14th and finishing 10th. Only 13 drivers saw the checkered flag. The McLaren of Stoffel Van Dorn never started the race after losing water pressure in the garage. The Haas of Kevin Magnussen suffered an electrical failure on lap 9, the Red Bull of Max Verstappen crashed into the barriers at turn 4 on lap 12 with a brake failure, the Toro Rosso of Carlos Sainz and the Williams of Lance Stroll crashed into each other on lap 13, and the Sauber of Marcus Ericsson suffered a gearbox failure on lap 51. The McLaren of Fernando Alonso complained all race about the lack of power from his Honda power unit, which eventually died on lap 55, but he was still classified in 14th. In 2018, it was the Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel who took pole position by 2/10 from teammate Kimi Raikkonen. The Mercedes of Valtteri Bottas was third. His teammate, defending champion Lewis Hamilton, qualified 4th but was relegated to 9th following a gearbox change. Vettel survived a late challenge from Bottas after running an extremely long second stint to win the race for the second year in a row, but Bottas did get fastest lap. Hamilton climbed through to 3rd. The Toro Rosso of Pierre Gasly finished a sensational 4th, and the Haas of Kevin Magnussen drove a strong race to 5th. The Renault of Nico Hülkenberg was 6th. The McLarens of Fernando Alonso and Stoffel Van Dorn were 7th and 8th, the Sauber of Marcus Ericsson was 9th, and the Force India of Esteban Ocon 10th. The Red Bull of Daniel Ricciardo suffered an electrical failure on lap 2. Just before this happened, teammate Max Verstappen hit Hamilton at turn 3 and got a puncture and then lost the gearbox on lap 4. Most notably, however, Raikkonen ran over one of his pit mechanics during his second stop on lap 35 after the left rear tyre was not properly fitted, breaking the mechanic's leg and forcing Vettel to run his extremely long second stint. In 2019, Charles Leclerc took a surprise pole position in only his second race with Ferrari, 3/10 ahead of teammate and vice-champion Sebastian Vettel, with the Mercedes of defending champion Lewis Hamilton 3rd and teammate Valtteri Bottas 4th. Leclerc lost the lead at the start but within a few laps had taken it back. However, later on in the race he lost power and dropped to 3rd, with Hamilton and Bottas taking a Mercedes 1-2, but still got a point for fastest lap. The Red Bull of Max Verstappen finished just behind Leclerc in 4th. Vettel had developed a reputation as a spinner in 2018, and he did this once again while battling with Hamilton and finished 5th. The McLaren of Lando Norris started 9th and finished 6th, jumping the Alfa Romeo of Kimi Raikkonen, who started 8th and finished 7th. The Red Bull of Pierre Gasly had a poor race despite jumping from 13th to 8th. The Toro Rosso of Alexander Albon started 12th and finished 9th, and the Racing Point of Sergio Perez jumped from 14th to 10th. The only official retirement was the Haas of Romain Grosjean, who hit the Racing Point of Lance Stroll on the first lap and retired on lap 17. On lap 54, the Renaults of Nico Hülkenberg and Daniel Ricciardo both lost power, and the McLaren of Carlos Sainz suffered a gearbox failure, but they were still classified in 17th, 18th and 19th. The 2020 running of the Bahrain Grand Prix was originally set to be the second round of the season. However, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic threw the world into disarray and forced most races to be postponed and rescheduled. A new calendar was eventually written up, with the Bahrain Grand Prix now taking place in November as the 15th of 17 rounds, and as with most races that year, it took place without spectators present. The country's human rights record had come under scrutiny once again, as Formula One's commitment to diversity and inclusion under the slogan "We Race as One" meant many people started pointing fingers at the country's treatment of women, LGBT people, and religious and ethnic minorities. The Mercedes of defending champion Lewis Hamilton had won his 7th title at the previous round in Turkey, and he took pole by 3/10 from teammate Valtteri Bottas. The Haas of Romain Grosjean, who had started 19th, cut across the AlphaTauri of Daniel Kvyat exiting turn 3 and was sent head-on into the Armco barriers. The front half of the car punched straight through, but the rear half was torn away, which ruptured the fuel tank and caused both halves to burst into flames. The medical car was immediately on the scene and the race was red flagged. Grosjean was enveloped in the flames for approximately 30 seconds before eventually managing to squeeze through the gap between the halo and the barriers, and remarkably suffered no broken bones or any lung damage, and had only suffered second-degree burns to his hands. He credited the halo with saving his life, and any discussions about its effectiveness or necessity since its introduction in 2018 were finally put to rest. The race was restarted over an hour later after a temporary barrier of concrete blocks was erected at the crash site. Hamilton took the win, just ahead of the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, who also took fastest lap, with teammate Alexander Albon in 3rd. The McLarens of Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz were 4th and 5th. The AlphaTauri of Pierre Gasly was just behind in 6th, and the Renault of Daniel Ricciardo was 7th. Bottas got a puncture at the restart and dropped down to 8th. Ricciardo's teammate Esteban Ocon was 9th, and the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc was 10th. As well as the aforementioned Grosjean, the Racing Point of Lance Stroll hit Kvyat at turn 8 and ended up upside down, and Stroll's teammate Sergio Perez's engine went up in smoke on lap 54 after running in 3rd, but he was still classified in 18th. A double header was hosted at Sakir in 2020, as the following weekend the inaugural Sakir Grand Prix took place, which used the circuit's outer configuration, just over 2 miles in length, with lap times of well under a minute. The grid had been thrown into disarray in the preceding week as Lewis Hamilton tested positive for COVID-19 and was forced to sit out the race. His seat was then taken by the highly rated Williams driver George Russell, whose seat at Williams was then taken by their reserve driver Jack Aitken. Romain Grosjean was still recovering from his accident and had decided he no longer wanted to race in Formula 1 anyway, so his seat at Haas was taken by their reserve driver Pietro Fittipaldi. Bottas saved his reputation somewhat by taking pole by less than 0.04 of a second from Russell, who in turn was 0.03 ahead of Verstappen. A chaotic race saw Sergio Perez take his first win after taking damage at the start and climbing up from last. Esteban Ocon also took the first podium of his career in 2nd, and Perez's teammate Stroll was 3rd. Sainz was 4th, Ricciardo was 5th, Albon was 6th, and Kvyat was 7th. Mercedes had a disastrous race. Russell took the lead at the start and was controlling the race until Aitken spun on lap 61 and broke his front wing, triggering a safety car. Both drivers pitted, but Russell was fitted with Bottas's tyres, and the delay meant Bottas was stationary for half a minute and was sent back out on the same tyres he'd come in on. Russell then pitted again the following lap to put on the right set of tyres, leaving them 4th and 5th. Russell aggressively passed Bottas again at the restart, and on his fresher tyres stormed his way up to 2nd, and was prepared to take the lead again, but then got a puncture and pitted yet again and dropped to 14th. Bottas dropped to 8th on his worn tyres, and Russell finished 9th and set fastest lap, and Norris started 19th and finished 10th. Leclerc crashed into Perez at turn 4 at the start, which forced Verstappen to go onto the runoff and then hit the barriers, and the Williams of Nicholas Latifi suffered an oil leak on lap 54. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic still going on, a more typical calendar was devised for 2021, with the Bahrain Grand Prix being the opening round of the season. As such, it was the debut race for the Alpine team, and for drivers Yuki Tsunoda, Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin. Speculation around the pace of Red Bull and Mercedes came true during qualifying as Max Verstappen took pole by 0.4 from Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton's teammate Valtteri Bottas was 3rd, but Verstappen's teammate Sergio Perez was way down in 11th. Verstappen led the opening part of the race, but ran a long first stint which meant he was undercut by Hamilton. He caught back up to him and passed him at turn 4 on lap 52. However, he'd gone off track to do so, despite the fact that Hamilton had consistently been abusing track limits at that corner, and so let Hamilton back through on the back straight, but was unable to get past him again and gave Hamilton the win. Bottas had a botched pit stop which dropped him further behind and he finished 3rd, but got fastest lap. The McLaren of Lando Norris finished 4th. Perez's car died on the formation lap, but he got it going again and started from the pit lane and climbed up to 5th. The Ferrari of Charles Leclerc dropped from 4th to 6th. Norris's teammate Daniel Ricciardo finished 7th, the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz started 8th and finished 8th, Tsunoda finished 9th for AlphaTauri on his debut, and the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll finished 10th. Mazepin, who started 19th after blocking several drivers in qualifying, lost control exiting turn 3 on the first lap and crashed into the barriers, having one of the shortest debuts in Formula 1 history. The Alpine of the returning Fernando Alonso had a brake failure on lap 33. The AlphaTauri of Pierre Gasly lost the gearbox on lap 53, and the Williams of Nicholas Latifi had a turbocharger failure on lap 52, but they were still classified in 17th and 18th. The 2022 running of the Bahrain Grand Prix is set to be the first race to see cars running with ground effect in 40 years. It's a race that divides fans over the quality of the racing and the country's legitimacy as a host, but it's become a staple of the Formula 1 calendar and a popular testing venue, and since becoming a night race there has been a noticeable improvement in the quality of the racing action, with the 2014 and 2021 races in particular becoming modern classics. The Bahrain Grand Prix will be on the Formula 1 calendar until at least 2036, by which point it will have been more than 30 years since Michael Schumacher won the first race, which will make it one of the longest running Grand Prix in Formula 1 history and give it numerous opportunities to provide many more classic races in the future. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Brook_F1, and I'll see you all next time.